All right, so after step 20 in the project 1.1.2, digital learning, it talks about conditionals a little bit, and I appreciate if you watch this video. She talks about how conditionals affect programs, and really what conditionals do is they take input from a user, and then depending on what input they get, they run different parts of code. And so what this allows us to do is make programs more reactive to what a user does, because if a user chooses certain options, then our code should react a certain way, and if they choose other options, it should react differently. One thing that she shows is flowcharts, and so I want to go through a few examples of those in the context of Trinket and the block-based coding that we've been using so far. So here's a conditional. It's a pretty simple program in that it's only a few lines of code. In this first line here, it asks the user how old are they, and it saves whatever they type as a variable called age. Notice that they're asking for a specific number, and that's really important because if you leave this as a text, then even if they type in a number, it doesn't really work well with the rest of the program. So we ask them for how old they are, we save that as age, and then we say that if the number that they typed is greater than 17, then they are allowed to see R-rated movies in a theater. All right? And if whatever age they typed, if it's not greater than 17, then we skip this middle part and we go down to else. We say that they aren't allowed to see R-rated movies in a theater. All right, so this is very simple. Just if one thing is true, then there's a result, and if that isn't true, there's a different result. The flowchart of that looks something like this. And it says if the age is greater than 17, and then there are two branches, and we can only go on one branch. And that's because this question is called a Boolean question, meaning that it can only be completely true or completely false, which means that we have to follow one of these pathways, and then we end up at a result where they can see or they cannot see R-rated movies in a theater. The next example I have is quite a bit more complex, but I want you to understand that by looking at these in a specific way, this actually becomes a lot more manageable. So we'll start at the top. The first row or the first line of code asks the same question, how old are you? And then it says, if your age is greater than 15, we're going to do a whole bunch of other things, okay? Because all of this is nested within that first conditional. And so all of this only happens if the person is greater than 15 years old. If the person is less than 16, or if they're 15 years old or younger, then we skip all of this code and we go directly to, you are not old enough to get your driver's license. So if someone was using this program and they said that they were 12 years old, we wouldn't bother asking them if they've completed driver's ed or if they completed behind the wheel, because they're not old enough to do any of those things. Therefore, they're not old enough to get their driver's license, and we skip all of this code. But if someone says that they're 16, well, then we have to ask further questions to see whether or not they can apply for a license. So if they are greater than 15, then we have to ask them another question. So we set another variable for this new question. And this time we're not asking for a number, we're asking for text. And we ask, have you completed driver's education? And we tell them you can either type Y or you can type N for yes or no. Then we say, if the answer that you just provided to that question is yes, if it is equal to a capital Y, then we have to ask you more questions. But if they typed N, or if they typed any other answer, then we'll skip all of this stuff in the middle and we'll go and tell them you must complete driver's education before you can get your driver's license. And so this pattern goes on and on until they've answered yes to all the questions, and then that's when they get an output that says they can get a driver's license. In a flowchart, it looks like this, and I understand that the text is very, very small, but what we should see is that there's only one pathway that they can go on to get all the way to getting a license, and that has to be that that they're old enough and that all of those other requirements are met. At any point, if they say no, then they get spit out of this flowchart and they can't get a license. So there's lots of different ways to not get a license, but there's only one way that they can actually finish up and get one. In the video, she mentions nested conditionals, and these are all nested conditionals because they only happen if the conditional outside of them is true. The last example that I have has one nested conditional down here, but it also has an else if. And what that does is instead of just having two options of true or false, if the first thing that it checks is false, then it checks another thing before it finally ends up with else. So here it asks the same question, how old are you? If you're older than 16, then automatically it says you can donate blood. But if you're not older than 16, instead of just telling you that you can't donate, it checks if you are exactly 16 years of age, because if that's true, then you might be able to donate. And so what this shows us is that even if the first thing that we check isn't true, we can check multiple criteria using else ifs until we find one that is true, and then do some kind of result based on that. The flowchart looks like this. And so it shows that if you are older than 16, you can donate blood. But if you are not older than 16, but you're exactly 16, then there's another option that you might be able to donate. And so instead of having just one option where you can donate, there are multiple routes based on your age and whether or not you have parent permission. This slide just tells you a little bit about where to find these blocks when you're completing this assignment. I would absolutely start by creating a variable and then setting the value of that variable based on a prompt for either a number or for text. And then you'll be using at least 2 conditionals in this example for today. In order to get the else part of this, when you grab the conditional block from the logic menu, you'll see that it comes out with just an if and a do. I can actually show that right now. This last page is a GIF of it, but if you go to Trinket and in the logic menu, if you pull this conditional out, you'll see that it doesn't have an else option. So to get that else option, you have to click the gear, and then you can drag else onto this small if before closing the gear, and now you have that else option down below. You can build this with multiple else ifs, and you can deconstruct it as well as construct it in this gear menu. So for today's assignment, what I'd like you to do is create a program that asks at least 2 questions, so it has at least 2 conditionals of whether something is true or not. And then I would like you to take a screenshot of it in Trinket and also draw a flowchart for it. So I'll show you how to do that right now. Here you've got I'm going to refresh this real quick. You've got the Trinket that I made for that slideshow. Here we go. And so you can find the code that you make sure that it's all on screen, and then take a screenshot with Control, Shift, and the window key above the number 6. Once you click and drag, then this is saved to your downloads folder, and so you'll be able to upload that to Google Classroom. Then the second step is drawing a flowchart, which you can do in 2 ways. You can either go to canvas.apps.chrome. Once you're here, you can use a stylus and you can draw a flowchart. With this flowchart, I would recommend drawing the shapes first, and then you can just draw text next to it that says if someone is older than 17, let's say. You can write then and so forth, so you don't have to fit all of your text inside of the shapes. If you zoom in, you might be able to do that, but it's not a requirement. The other option that you have, and then to export that once you're done with your flowchart, you can click the 3-dot menu and save as an image. And then this also would be able to be uploaded to Google Classroom. Or if you go to Drive and you click New and More, you can choose a Google Drawing. And then in a Google Drawing, there is a Shape toolbar. And in this Shape toolbar, you have access to diamonds, and squares, and ovals. And then once you um, position all of these, you can type in them by just double clicking, and you can make lines with the line tool in order to connect them from one item to another. So either one of these options is fine, but once you make your flowchart, if you're using Google Drawings, you would then save it as, or download it rather, as a JPEG or a PNG. And then both of those files, the screenshot of your code and the flowchart of your conditionals, can be uploaded to Classroom. Thank you very much for watching.